Hello, and welcome to our discussion on informative speaking. In this video, we're going to talk about what exactly is informative speaking, what factors you should focus on when giving these types of speeches, something called logos, which are logical appeals, and the Tolman model of an argument, and some informative essentials. So, right off the bat here, what is informative speaking? This is basically a speech, or if you're not doing a speech, it's some sorts of information content done for the purpose of increasing your audience's knowledge or awareness of a topic, but not intending to persuade them to take action. Okay? So, really, what you're doing, just like the title sounds, is you're trying to give your audience information about something, right? You're trying to help them understand something. You're trying to explain something, but you're not actually trying to create that action step where they are persuaded and now going to take what you said and have take certain steps moving forward. Now, the big key here, a lot of people understand that, right? Informative versus persuasive when you're seeing information or seeing a message, okay? The big key, though, is how do you be successful in terms of informative speaking? And what I mean by being successful is essentially how do you get your audience to pay attention and care about your topic? And a lot of that has to do, I mean, you can do things like we will talk about this. I certainly talk about this in other videos, and you'll hear people talk about things like doing an audience analysis, which is trying to gear your message and your content and your delivery in a manner that is going to be most effective for a given audience, such as a given demographic, right? Or an audience with a certain prior viewpoint or bent on a subject. But beyond that, without even knowing anything about your audience, in terms of an audience analysis type thing, is there are certain things you can just focus on and sort of brainstorm ahead of time to make it more likely that your audience is going to pay attention and really be more informed on your topic. And that is focusing on information ahead of time. So you can just brainstorm these out. That is either new information, information in a different context, okay, or clarifying understandings of a topic. So you have those big three, right? And what I mean by that is, again, right before you're going to speak about a topic or as you start to sort of prepare your information, is just ask yourself, what does my audience likely know and not know? Okay. What are their sort of the holes in their knowledge, and can I fill those in this presentation? Or what is information that maybe they know, maybe they've considered it, but not in the context that I can talk to them about, right? So maybe this is a new application of it. Excuse me. Or is this just a topic that has a lot of things where there's misunderstanding? So the audience has a viewpoint, they think they know about the topic, but maybe there's something more you can add. And the reason it matters to brainstorm this ahead of time is if you hit them with this right away, early on in the presentation, you are more likely to grab your audience's attention and make them feel like, hey, I should keep listening here. So I'm going to give you a quick example of this. Let's say a client comes into my office and they want to hire a lawyer for something. Okay. And so let's say they want to hire me to do a divorce and custody case. So they say, hey, I'm thinking of getting divorced. I'm married. I got two kids. Want custody. We got a house. Can you help me out with that? Thinking of hiring a lawyer, right? And let's say I say to them, yeah, you could get divorced. Might have to pay child support. FYI. Now give me 5,000. I need a $5,000 retainer. Do you think I'm likely? Now look, when I say I need a $5,000 retainer, at that point I'm being persuasive, right? I'm like, you should hire me. But at the beginning, when I'm being informative and I say, yeah, you can get divorced, might have to pay child support. Do you think that's going to make somebody feel like, gee, I should really hire a lawyer? Gee, it's really worth paying this person $5,000 retainer, potentially hundreds an hour? Probably not. A lot of you are going to go, well, thank you, Captain Obvious. I have Google, right? In other words, I did not tell them anything that's new, anything that's not understood, nothing to really grab their attention to really think this is worth it, right? Or to necessarily think I'm that skilled of an attorney. So that's not what I do. I've already brainstormed ahead of time what's new, right? What's not understood or what's a misclarification. So, for example, when that person comes in, the first thing I say is not, well, you might have to pay child support and yeah, you can get divorced, right? I don't lead with Captain Obvious. He's not the first person getting off the boat onto that shore, right? The first thing I say is, well, have you moved? Do you want custody? And they say yes. Let's say they say yes. Then I say, well, have you moved out? They say, yeah, got an apartment. Didn't want to disrupt the kids. It's easier. They get to stay at the house in their rooms, blah, blah, blah. They go to the same school. And then I will say, bad move, bad move. You already made a mistake. Now, the reason that you made a mistake is that courts don't necessarily, in a lot of states, favor mom or dad. What they favor is the primary caregiver. So the primary caregiver is the person who's taking the kids to school, wiping the runny noses, making their lunches, in other words, doing the daily raising of that child. And it just so happens that tends to be mom, right? Dad typically leaves, unfortunately, and it tends to be mom who's doing that stuff. So that's why moms tend to end up with custody oftentimes, right? So if you've already moved out, you've now made yourself not the primary caregiver, likely, unless the kids are staying half the nights with you, right? And so that's going to hurt your custody case. Does it mean you can't win custody? No, but it's really hurt it. Now, if I start off with that little nugget, all of a sudden that person is more like, because that's information that's new to them. It's not well known, right? So they're more likely to go, man, I maybe need to hire a lawyer. I maybe need to listen to this guy, right? I should pay attention. I'm like, now I'm on the edge of, I'm going to listen to what you have to say, right? Because I hit them with something they didn't know. Because I'd already brainstormed ahead of time. What's new information? What's information in different context? What can I clarify that you misunderstand? Right? And that's going to make people pay attention for the rest of the speech, right? This is no different than when you start watching, for example, a YouTube video, and the video starts off with the person going, it's got the clickbait, and then the person says, "What if I told you?" Right? And then whatever, like, crazy thing, right? Because they're trying to grab your attention with something you didn't maybe know, right? Which wasn't obvious. If you ever heard I don't know if you've heard this phrase, but there's a phrase, you don't know what you don't know. And in other words, you don't always know, like, the gaps in your knowledge. So you can't just Google your way out of them, so to speak, right? Well, I'll just figure it out. Well, you don't even know where to start to, like, search to figure it out, right? If you've never heard the term primary caregiver, you ain't Googling that, right? So it's kind of, the reason I say it's kind of apt now is because people, unfortunately, there's a lot of people, certainly in a student situation, who think, well, I could just Google and AI my way out of every assignment. It's like, well, you're still going to fail a lot of things because you don't really know the basics enough to even do that well, right? And so this is why you want to leave a new information. Again, going back to that, is it just grabs people's attention. And by the way, I've done that with every type of case I have. I do it in criminal cases where one of the first things I say is not like, well, man, if you get convicted, you might have a record and you might go to jail, and it's not, and it's probation or blah, blah, blah. Like, for example, if it's a criminal case, and let's say the person's young, one of the first things I will say to them is, well, let me ask you something. Assuming you don't want to be a career criminal, right? What's your life goal? What's the end game? Let's drive ahead of the car a little bit. And the person says, well, I want to be, you name it, right? Whatever the field is. And what I will say to them is, depending on whatever this field is, right? Is, well, do you know that, like, if you get certain convictions or you have certain things in your background, you can no longer enter that field? Like, they just exclude you, okay? As part of either just unofficially blacklisting you, or literally it's just part of their rules, okay? Because it could create a situation, right? It's sort of like, the government doesn't want, like, if you want to be in the FBI, for example, or you want to be in the CIA, if you have filed for bankruptcy, if you have really poor credit, it is very unlikely they will take you. Now, why is that? Because you're financially compromised. In other words, you could be blackmailed because clearly you have money problems, right? So they don't want you. So it's kind of like that. So if you get a criminal record with certain things, you're screwing up your future for other things you may want to do. So one of the first things I say to them, okay, that's a great end life goal, and I hope you get there. But if you want to do that, you might want to stop filing for bankruptcy, right? If you want to be in the FBI, or if you want to, you name, like, also some of these career fields where you get a license or something. It's like, well, if you want that license, you need to stop having these criminal convictions because they just won't take you, right? And so I lead with information that maybe they haven't thought of. Now that is kind of more of like different, maybe like different context. Like they haven't realized there's implications to a criminal conviction beyond the conviction itself and sentencing, right? So my point is just you'll grab people's attention if you just brainstorm these things ahead of time. Like think about what's new, think about what you can clarify, what's misunderstood. So that's what informative speaking is, and that's kind of what you should focus on. Now, I wanted to bring up logical arguments here, which are logos. So we talk about, I mean, you may have heard this certainly in other courses you've taken. I talk about some of this in other videos, certainly. But this notion of there's three core types of arguments. You have logos, ethos, pathos. And logos are basically what's called logical appeals. And then you have ethos, which are appeals to credibility. This is essentially trust me because of my experience, right? Trust me because, like, trust me, I'm a doctor, right? I give you a conclusion A, you should believe it because I'm a doctor. Then there's appeals, there are pathos, which are appeals to emotion. So this is basically you're going to take a certain action or reach a certain conclusion because it's giving you an emotional valence that you want. It's making you happy. It's relieving stress or anxiety, like you name, right? You name the emotion. Logical appeals are basically a conclusion that is supported, and then here's the definition, right, with some sort of evidence or reasoning. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up here is because when you are being informative, you are trying to be as objective and rational and as possible about a situation. So certainly a lot of logical appeals. You're just trying to describe. It's basically a situation where I am just describing the duck, right? I'm not telling you the duck's good or bad. I'm just telling you it walks like a duck and it quacks, quacks like a duck. It does duck things. Okay. Whether it's good or bad, that's for you to decide, right? But I'm just describing the situation. Okay. And so you want to be as logical as possible when you're doing that. So you want to be as like clear cut down the middle as you can. So that's why I'm kind of bringing up logical appeals are. But again, the definition, supporting an argument with evidence or reasoning. Now, one of the things that I kind of want to bring up about this, by the way, is right off the top, there is something here that a lot of people are just missing in society, because I see this all the time, where when people are making arguments or debating something, and let's say you don't have evidence for something, and the person says, well, therefore your conclusion's not logical. Like, or you're stupid to believe that because there's no evidence, right? Well, I'm not going to call them stupid, but the person who says that, they're the one who's not being logical or rational. So if you say you shouldn't believe something because there's no evidence, I need evidence first, so I don't believe it. That's actually not applying logic, because look up the definition, right? Like it's kind of like the movie The Princess Bride, where the character says, "You keep using that word. I don't think it means what you think it means." Great movie, by the way. You need to watch The Princess Bride if you haven't seen it. The younger kids now. I've mentioned before, I think, in a video, if I mention a movie past like 2000, they just look at you and they're like, "Was it in color, dude?" Right? Where their caption, I mean, what was happening? Great movie. You need to watch it. But anyway, Princess Bride, he goes, "You keep using that word. I don't think it means what you think it means." A lot of people like to throw around the words logic and rationality, and they don't even know what it means. Like they're not even using it right. That's the definition. So here's my point. It doesn't require evidence. Read the definition. It says supporting an argument with evidence or means alternatively reasoning, meaning you don't have to have evidence. Now, would you rather have evidence? Sure. Proof is better. Fun fact. But why wouldn't you have evidence? A couple of reasons, right? First of all, the evidence may be lost to time. You can't get it anymore. It's gone. Right? This is like the tree falls in the woods and nobody's there. I didn't hear it. I didn't see it fall. And let's say the wind knocked it down or there was a storm. So just because I wasn't there to validate the storm caused the fall, it doesn't mean the storm didn't cause the fall. It still did. Right? I think a better example that I kind of like from my field is looking at this. So first of all, you just might not be able to get the evidence and maybe lost to time. There's that. Lost to history, right? Second reason you might not get the evidence or you might not have evidence for something, but it's still true just the same, which is that sometimes you can't get the evidence because you don't have the ability to like discover it. You just don't have the technology essentially to discover it. So an example would be, let's say a murder is committed in 1980 and a murder was committed yesterday. And let's say it's committed exactly the same way with the exact same DNA evidence and forensics left at the scene. So the murder in 1980, does it mean, because we don't have DNA testing yet, we don't have the forensic evidence then that we have now. Does that mean that evidence isn't there? Does it mean the murder didn't happen? No, it's still there. We just don't have the DNA to test for it yet. Doesn't mean it's not real. It means we can't discover the evidence. You know, um, just because you can't discover something doesn't mean it's not true, right? You just don't have the ability to discover it yet. So now there's a chance that it might not be true. But if you walk around just saying every conclusion that can't be currently validated by evidence is just wrong and stupid, you are the one, right, that is making really broad assumptions that are completely irrational. Okay? It is true that those conclusions may be incorrect, but they have not been logically invalidated. Okay? Because we may not have the ability to get the evidence yet. So DNA and forensics evidence is an example of that. It was still there in 1980, but we couldn't test for it. And by the way, that's why a lot of detectives at those crime scenes still gathered things and kept certain things as evidence, because they knew that, hey, later maybe we develop some testing that can help us here, right? And that's how it helps them solve cold cases and things like that. One of the methods, right? So one of the things I just wanted to quickly sort of like bring up is that logic does not require evidence. But anyway, when you're being informative, you want to be logical and rational wherever you can, right? So let's talk about what a logical argument is. You generally have these three components here that you got going on. You've got a claim. This is the conclusion that you're trying to support. So this is just when you're just making an argument, just fundamentally, right? A logical appeal. You've got a claim, your conclusion. You've got data, which is the proof used, and this is the Tolman model, which is the basic three components of an argument. You have data, which is just some way to support that argument, okay? So it's a proof used to support it. This could be evidence, this could be physical evidence, this could be a statistic, this could be some sort of reasoning if you don't have the evidence, ways to connect the dot. And then you have a warrant, which is an unstated assumption that you must accept about the data in order for the data to be relevant to the conclusion. So in other words, you have a conclusion, you support it with something, but usually there's an assumption underlying that connects the two, okay? Now warrants, I think when you read that definition, it's a little hard to understand unless you see a sample. So let me show you an example here. This comes from the NBA, National Basketball Association. All right. If I said the 76ers are going to win tonight, okay, they're going to win their basketball game. And my reason, the data is I say they're playing at home. What's the unstated assumption? It's that home teams usually win in the NBA. So if home teams in the NBA did not have a home court advantage, that would be completely illogical and irrational to say. So there has to be that connection part there, right? So you have the conclusion and it's supported by some underlying assumption. Now, it'd be like if I said that dog is probably friendly. Let's say that's my claim. And I support it by saying it's a golden retriever after all. What's the assumption? Golden retrievers are friendly. Okay. I have no idea if they are. I'm more of a cat person, right? Dogs, it's just I don't dislike dogs, but there's an extra level of maintenance there. And I mean, I have a hard time walking myself, right? All right, so you have all three, right? You got to have three. Now, I will say here, an argument can have more than one warrant. Sometimes there's like several assumptions. And, I will say also as a side note that, if you're going to be cynical about it, sometimes what people do is the warrant is where they're kind of implying or suggesting something without actually saying it out loud. So the claim, how they support the claim suggests something, and the warrant in the warrant, right? And they just don't want to say it, whatever the warrant is, okay? Because maybe it's just something I don't want to put their name to, right? It'll make them look bad, so they're just not comfortable saying it out loud. So sometimes when I say being cynical, what I mean is sometimes you can imply things with warrant that maybe are a little cynical. But you have these three parts in any type of logical argument or rational argument. And again, my comment about evidence versus reasoning is that's kind of like the data part, right? Like you can have how you support the claim could be evidence, could be reasoning, but you have all three. So when you're giving a form of speech, you want to make sure that you are fundamentally sticking, right? That you're being logical, using logical appeals, using very rational, complete Tolman arguments, right? Because you don't want to be skewing things. Now, I will notice or spinning them a certain way, right? Because you're trying to be neutral. I will sort of point out also that there's three types of claims or conclusions, right? You have conclusions of fact, conclusions of value, and conclusions of policy. Conclusions of fact are concluding that something is non-disputable. So it's saying it's always true. So It's like saying if I was in a classroom and I dropped the laser pointer, if the conditions of gravity are present, that laser pointer will fall to the ground at the same rate of speed every time, all the time, right? It just is. The sun, right, rises in a certain direction, sets in another direction, right? This street runs from north to east, right? It's a verifiable fact that is non-disputable. Okay. Conclusions of value. These are claims essentially involving opinions or moral judgment. So they are a little disputable. Okay. One person could believe A, one person could believe B. There's not necessarily a moral truth to that. It's sort of like, let's take ethics, right? Ethical principles are really in the eye of the beholder, right? I may have a certain ethical paradigm or make certain choices that I believe are ethical, and you may disagree with those and make different choices, okay? Policies are conclusions with a plan of action. So this is when you're telling somebody either what to do. So certainly persuasive speeches tend to have a lot of these built in, at least towards the end, or the broader goal of the presentation or the persuasive message. But in general, it's a conclusion where you hold this belief or idea that this is what should be done. Okay. Now I would say the most important thing to take away from these three types of conclusions is that generally when you're being given informative presentations, you're staying at the fact conclusion level where you're just like, this is true about the duck, this is true about the duck, but again, I'm not telling you if the duck's good or bad. Do you sometimes describe value and policy conclusions in an informative speech? You do, but notice I said the word describe, meaning let's take topics that have clear arguments surrounding them, like let's take gun control, right, or abortion. I can give an informative presentation on gun control that's still informative and talk about, in fact, I have to. You can't give a gun control presentation without talking about the arguments surrounding both sides, right? So if I can do that and be informative. I just have to not be advocating for those positions. So in other words, in that speech, I might tell you, here are the value conclusions and the policy conclusions of people that are pro-gun control and people that are anti-gun restrictions, right? Or more stringent gun restrictions. So I'm just describing those value positions or those policy conclusions, but I'm not actually saying, hey, and I'm on board with that, okay? So they can come into an informed presentation if you're just describing them. And again, in a persuasive speech, they're probably coming in because you're promoting them, right? So I would point that out about informative speaking. A broader sort of big picture reason this matters is because this is a little bit on the order of like how hard it is to prove. So in other words, conclusions of fact are the easiest to prove. Or really, I shouldn't say prove so much as get your audience on board with. Conclusions of value are the second hardest, and then the hardest is policy. Now, why is this? Well, let's take conclusions of value involving opinions or morals or things like that, right? What's right or wrong? When our beliefs about what's right or wrong is usually also a reflection of what we think the facts are, right? So, in other words, we have to agree on the facts before we can agree on the morals. If, an example would be, if somebody came in the room and they said A is right or A is wrong, that's their conclusion. So it's a value conclusion. And they said it's right or wrong because, and then they quote a religious text, right? So some sort of religious text, and they quote that theology and they say, well, see, this text is telling you it's right or wrong. So that's the data. That's how they're trying to support it. What has to be true for you for that type of argument structure to work to persuade you? Now, in this case, again, it's persuasive. Well, you have to think that religious text is authoritative on morality, right? Like, in other words, you have to be a member of that religion or buy into that religion. Because if you don't, that ain't going to work on you, right? If you're atheist, right? If you're agnostic or you're just not a member of that religion, that might not mean anything to you, right? So typically we can't agree on morals unless we agree on facts. So you have to agree on, in that hypothetical, you have to agree on the fact, right, that religious text is morally authoritative. So morals are a little harder to prove because you have to make sure the audience all agrees on the same set of facts, right? And policy is the hardest for that very similar reason, which is that typically we can't agree on a course of action to take unless we agree on the morals and the facts, right? Because supposedly what we do, right, our actions are a reflection on our moral beliefs and positions, right? So they're a hierarchy in terms of what's more difficult, just like something I thought I'd point out. Another thing that I thought I would point out, and this isn't necessarily like right or wrong, but the reason I'm bringing this up is like at least own it. Like, put your name to what you're doing. Like be aware of it, I guess is what I'm saying. There are some people that basically say, okay, you have fact statements and then you have morals positions, right? Moral conclusions. And then so there's people like that who like separate the two. And then there's other people who say my morals are facts. They're not separate. My morals are just inherently true. They're not just right for me, they're right for you. And if you disagree with me, too bad. You don't have the right to disagree with me. I'm going to make you agree with me until you fall in line. And I'm not saying really, honestly, like either's right or wrong. You have to decide what's best for your life. But people actually kind of live their life kind of like two ways on that one. And just be aware of it, like own it either way, whatever you're doing. Be aware of it. So I'll give you an example of that. Let's take a topic like abortion, for example. You can have two people that are pro-choice, and like one's pro-choice and they vote pro-choice, and one or I'm sorry, I screwed that up. You can have two people that are pro-life, okay, or anti-abortion, okay. So one person is pro-life and they actually vote pro-choice, and the other person's pro-life and they vote pro-life, right? So what's the difference between the two? It's this difference. One is separating them and one is not. So the person who's pro-life and they vote, but yet they vote pro-choice, you're like, how can that happen? What are they doing? They're saying my morals are not facts for everybody, right? They're basically saying what is true for me, what is morally right for me, my value conclusions are how I'm going to live my life. But they might not be true for everybody, and I'm going to let you decide what you want to do. And that's why they're voting pro-choice. They're giving you the choice to reach your own moral conclusion on that and be able to live your life by it. Okay? The person who's pro-life and votes pro-life, they are saying that their moral state conclusions, their value conclusion, in this case on the subject of abortion, is a fact. It's inherently true. And you do not have a right to disagree with me. You're just wrong if you do. And someday you'll see the light. But in the meantime, no can do, mi amigo. Right? That's what they're doing. Like, think about it. You're saying, just like the first person, I'm anti-abortion. I would not take part of that in my life or try to facilitate that. I think it's wrong. And everybody should agree with that. It's just wrong. And if you disagree, you are wrong. And I'm not going to let you disagree. So, because it's a fact, right? So they're saying their morals are facts. And by the way, they may be right. I don't know, right? Like, we all make our own decisions on that. But what I'm saying, I'm just saying again, own what you're doing. You are saying my morals are inherently true for everybody. Okay? And you're not going to disagree with me. So there's a difference between how people kind of live their lives on moral statements versus fact statements. And so again, it's kind of up to you to decide what to do, but I'm just saying some people separate and some people don't. But that actually explains that type of situation where you see people who actually may have similar opinions on things, but actually vote different ways. Because it kind of deals with how they're separating these types of conclusions. So those are the three types of conclusions. Types of data, these are basically types of evidence or ways that you support that conclusion, right? So you can support it through physical evidence. Hey man, physical evidence is the best. I mean, I was telling you, we oftentimes don't have evidence for things. I'd love to have evidence. You always want evidence, right? So evidence is always the best case scenario. For a lot of people, it's just very powerful to prove things. But, I actually shouldn't say always the best case scenario, because obviously there are some situations where maybe you don't have evidence, but like maybe something that's more mathematical or something like that. So you could have that works better in some situations. So you also have statistics. Statistics, of course, numbers, if it's that type of quantitative situation. You could have reasoning. So again, this is the scenario where I don't have the evidence, but there's ways for me to sort of intuitively connect the dots, right? Excuse me. So reasoning is just you figuring out how the dominoes are falling, right? And in accordance to each other and making the argument that way, even if you don't have necessarily the evidence. You sometimes support a conclusion with an ethos appeal. So you say, Here's my piece of medical advice, and the reason you should believe it is because I am a doctor, right? Or here's my legal advice, and you should believe it because I went to law school, right? So you're using the appeal to credibility, right? Just trust me because my conclusion is supported by something we always trust, which is that appeal to credibility. Sometimes you're using an appeal to emotion as the data. So you're sort of like combining these things, by the way, logos, ethos, pathos in these last three scenarios. So this is where you say, well, you should do this. You should do A because if you love somebody, you would. If you loved me, you would, right? Or you should do B because you care about your family and this supports your family, right? These types of appeals. Or you just in your head I mean, look, we make arguments, we persuade ourselves, we reach our own conclusions, right, in our mind. It's like when you do something because it's giving you a certain emotional feeling, or like I said, emotional valence, like it's relieving stress or anxiety or something like that. So that's how you're supporting it. So we tend to support these things in all kinds of different ways. There is types of reasoning that people also, if they're just using reasoning, so you don't quite have the evidence, you don't necessarily have a statistic, and maybe you're using an appeal to credibility or emotion somewhere in there as well to support it, but whether you are or not, will tend to fall into some schools of thoughts when it comes to reasoning. So there is causal reasoning. Causal reasoning is basically reasoning from cause and effect, where you say, I think A is causing B, right? Every time I eat junk food, I kind of like feel bad and like mentally kind of beat myself up for not taking better care of myself. I want to lose weight. Why am I eating junk food? So you're in your head, you're making that causal connection of, look, this is kind of creating sort of a mental tailspin for me a little bit, right? Beyond just physically feeling bad, I'm mentally feeling bad, right? That's causal reasoning. Now, we'll talk later about, like, or certainly I talk later in some videos about logical fallacies where you have to be careful with this type of reasoning because sometimes, um, first of all, it's not that the two things are causing each other, they might just be correlated. So when one goes up, the other goes up, they're not actually causing each other. Or one goes up and one always goes down. Doesn't mean they're causing each other, they might just be correlated for some other reason. Another issue is that you might identify the cause of something, but it's only a minor cause. It's not one of the major causes. So it's maybe not what you should be focusing on. Reasoning from analogy is basically comparing two cases, right? So it's very just like, and sometimes it's not really specific cases. It's just reasoning from like this situation is like this other situation, right? And so that's reasoning from analogy. And also there's reasoning from specific instances, which it's basically like an analogy, but it's applied to one situation, right? Now, one of the things you have to be careful about reasoning from analogy. So think of analogies again as just really broad situational comparisons, and reasoning from specific situations is when you make those comparisons to really specific situations, is that either one should be reinforced. And what I mean by that is essentially reinforced with other evidence or data points where you're looking at to say, is this really a good comparison? So the problem is you might be comparing, first of all, you might be comparing two situations that are not actually very similar, or at least they're not similar in key data points, meaning significant, like salient parts about those two situations that are like huge determining factors are not the same. So they're not good comparisons. Sometimes also, so you got to make sure the cases are similar. Here's the other problem. Sometimes it is indeed a very similar situation, but the first instance that you're drawing from, so this is when you're reasoning from specific instances, is a really bad example to use. It's just a screwed up example. So here's an example that would be, let's say you get a job and it's in a career or a field that you're actually really interested in. You really want to make this work, and it doesn't go well. Like, you struggle on your job, you struggle at the job. Your boss is always yelling at, nagging you, right? And they like fire you. They're like, you're not, you're not cut out for this, right? And so then you feel bad. You're like, I'm not very good at this. Now it's possible they're like, you need to work on your attitude, and you're not smart enough to do this, or you name the criticism they give you. Now, is it possible that your attitude sucks, or you weren't, you were having a hard time like adopting to the job? That's possible. But it's also possible you know, your boss didn't train you well, right? It's also possible that they actually were just downsizing and trying to figure out an excuse to let you go and didn't want to pay unemployment, so they found out a reason to fire you, right? Like, it's not always you. Sometimes it actually is them, you know? And so you got to be careful sometimes. It might have just been a bad situation. So that doesn't necessarily mean you should internalize that and go, well, I'm not a good worker, or I don't have a good attitude, or I'm not smart enough to do this. Maybe they didn't train you well, right? Maybe the boss is just kind of a jerk, right? Like, for a variety of reasons, they might have been, again, like I said, looking to fire you. It's not a bad comparison, right? I'm sorry, it's not a good comparison. Another example of this is, like, I teach interpersonal communication, and we have a whole section in there on relationships. And we talk about how people, unfortunately, will do this sometimes in relationships in a bad way. So you get into a relationship and you have a bad experience. It doesn't go well. In other words, it's particularly, it doesn't go well with how the other person is treating you, for example. So let's say, in worst cases, unfortunately, let's say they're abusive, whether it's physically or mentally, or they cheat on you, right? And then they tell you it's your fault, or all these reasons, or they give you some, well, everybody does it, or some, whatever. And you leave that relationship. And a lot of times people that are in these relationships, they leave it and they go, well, this is what I deserve. Right? Um, I was abused because I did this or that. Right? People do this. Or everybody cheats. And then they go into the next relationship sort of being okay with being treated that way, sometimes, unfortunately. Now, again, not everybody thinks this, but that's an example of, you had a bad experience and now you're using that as the model for what relationships are going forward. Well, first of all, not everybody cheats. Second of all, no, you did not deserve to be in an abusive relationship. You were dating an a-hole, right? So it's just a bad comparison. So sometimes we have events in our lives, right? And again, this isn't just about public speaking. You just apply this to your life, right? Sometimes we have things happen in our lives, and we then form opinions about ourselves or our potential, right, based on that event. And we say, this is the truth, or this is what I am, or this is what I'm capable of. And what I'm saying is, before you do that, make sure it's a fair example to draw from. It might just be a bad situation, right? Or you made certain mistakes because you were younger, just a bad situation, right? That isn't necessarily going to be true moving forward. And not only that, but even if you can't pinpoint some sort of external reason why it's a bad specific instance to compare whatever it you're trying to draw the comparison to, maybe it's not what's going to happen down the road, because now you're smarter, you're older, you're wiser, like whatever it may be, right? So be very careful about analogies, reasoning from specific instances, because you got to make sure the two cases you're comparing are similar. Um, so other types of reasonings, you have scientific, legal, and religious. Scientific is basically just applying the scientific method, right? So you are saying that we're going to test for something. We have to get measurable results. It has to be repeatable, right? This theory has to be applicable, right, under the same conditions where I get the same evidence, right, repeatedly over and over. So some people just like to think that way, just in terms of their mindset, right? And there's certainly nothing wrong with that, right? That's, in fact, if anything, it's certainly probably the best sort of method we've come up with in terms of trying to be objective and rational. Now, so that's scientific reasoning. Legal reasoning is basically, doesn't mean laws, it means reasoning from principles. So you basically create a rule, so to speak, and you live your life by that. It's like saying, I always do my best, or honesty is the best policy, right? And you just follow that principle. And then religious reasoning is when you use reasoning to reach a conclusion based on, of course, religious theology. So these are kind of like the first three, where these three all have pros and cons. So the pro of scientific reasoning in general is that it tends to force you to be objective and to really have to have evidence, essentially, before you reach conclusions. And even though evidence isn't required for logic, having evidence is certainly better than a lack of evidence, right? It certainly gives you more validation that a conclusion is true or correct. So that the advantage of it is it forces you to be objective and really have evidence before you reach a conclusion. Now, what's the disadvantage to it? Yes, there are disadvantages that people tend to not talk about. All right, so here are the two main disadvantages. The first disadvantage is that, as I mentioned before with this whole evidence thing, is that science is always limited by how far it's advanced. So it can only validate, it can only prove a conclusion up to the point for which it's advanced. And so therefore there's lots of things that are true that science can't prove yet, but are still true nonetheless, right? So that's the problem. It's limited in the sense that it has to advance. It's sort of like what I'm basically trying to say is if we go back in time to 1800, there were lots of things that were true that science couldn't validate yet, but they were still true, right? But the science was limited. So that limits the conclusions you can reach from it if you're just using that as your end all be all for truth, right, in the world. Another drawback to the scientific method is there's no real moral code. You can be the mad scientist. It's cool, right? So there's no moral paradigm. So that potentially is bad because it turns out humans can do bad things, right? They do have the capacity to do that. Legal reasoning. The benefit of that is it makes you be consistent, right? And it helps keep you objective. Like, I live my life by these principles. I don't let noise or the situation itself change me to being like true to myself and what I really want to be about. Now, the disadvantage to that is the principle might not be serving your life well. So, in other words, sometimes the principle is just a bad principle that you probably shouldn't be applying because it doesn't make you happy. It's not really serving your life well. It's not leading to the outcomes you want in your life, right? Also, that principle just might be outdated. In other words, think about it. There's lots of subjects where we knew one thing 10 years ago and now we know something else, or 20 years, right? So, like, sometimes we have this principle we're following in life and it's kind of outdated, right, for your life as it is today. So you have to be careful about that. Is it not serving you well? Is it outdated? Right, whatever it may be, not giving you the outcomes you want. Religious reasoning. So the obvious, now the benefit, the drawback to religious reasoning is that what if the theology is wrong? Right? What if it's just wrong? It's not true. That's a drawback, of course. Another drawback could be it's being misinterpreted. So the doctrine, the theology is not being taught to you in a correct manner, right? It's either being misinterpreted, it's being purposely warped or manipulated. That's another drawback. Okay, so those are the drawbacks. Now there is a real core benefit to this, though. I mean, certainly you could argue one benefit is maybe it's right, right? The second benefit, and there's people that have really, from an academic standpoint, that have argued this, not even in like religious circles, like, is that even if all of the world's religions are wrong, let's just say they're all wrong. It's all not real. Okay. They serve humanity a useful purpose because they implore a moral code. Right? Because pretty much the world's religions kind of all say, like, be nice to each other, don't be jerks, right? Have compassion for your fellow man or woman, right? And a lot of other types of things don't have a real moral code at all. There's no requirement for that. And it's in religious reasoning, right? And so there's people that argue that even if they're all wrong, religions serve a useful benefit to humanity because they force us to care about each other and not be a jerk, right? So that's kind of like the argument. Like, if you think about it, that's what all religions teach. And there might be one or two of you who are like, well, but look at all the bad things that are done in the name of religion. Well, the response to that, though, is that oftentimes all of the ugly things you see done under the color of religion is usually people that are twisting, warping that doctrine are completely or completely off the rails. Meaning they're doing awful things in the name of that religion, but they're actually doing things that religion, if you look at the actual theology or doctrine, in no way promotes. That's them promoting it. That's them twisting it. That's not the same thing. You got to separate the two. There's like the theology and the practice. Bad things have been done in the practice of religion. It doesn't mean the religion itself actually teaches those bad things. Remember that, right? And again, I'm telling you just truths about the duck. I'm describing the duck. I'm not telling you religion's good or bad. That's up to you. This is an informative video. But whether or not you like religion or not, all of these things are still true, right? That it does import a moral code, and that is like, be good to people, right? And the people that are bad to people in the name of it are going off the rails. They're doing things that aren't actually in those teachings. So that's the types of reasonings that you got going on that people tend to use. Some essentials, some things we need to keep in mind, kids. So first of all, always, I'm going to come back to this in a second, but be informed before you're persuasive. Use complete Tolman arguments and avoid fallacies. Adequately cover a topic, including opposing viewpoints, and set a neutral tone with your delivery. All right, so setting a neutral tone with your delivery, just real quickly, just means when you're being informative with somebody, whether it's for a whole presentation or it's at the beginning of something that later turns persuasive, it just means you need to make sure your delivery is neutral too, right? If you're just, let's say I'm giving that speech on gun control and I'm just being informative. So I'm telling you about the arguments on both sides. If while I'm doing that, I also then turn around and roll my eyes at one side or kind of make sarcastic comments where I make it clear to you which side of the fence I'm on, right? Clearly that's not informative anymore. You can pick that up. I mean, I talk about this in other videos, but you've heard that phrase 80-90% of communication is nonverbal. And what that means is a lot of the real meaning we take from something, we pick up from nonverbals. So when we interpret what somebody is really saying or what their communication means. So if I'm not being neutral with my nonverbals, you're still going to figure out which side I'm on. So you got to be neutral with that. You got to adequately cover a topic. If you don't, you can't ignore the elephant in the room. You can't ignore the weak points of a potential argument, the benefits of another side. Because if you do, people start to say, well, you're not really describing the duck, are you? Because you're leaving out the feathers and I don't know. I don't know a lot about ducks. I should maybe not use that analogy, but all the other things about ducks that are awesome, I guess, right? We like ducks. We feed them. They like bread. I like bread. I'm pro bread, pro carbs. Sorry, off topic. But you got to describe the whole thing. If it's clear you're leaving stuff out, people then start to question your objectivity, right? And they start to then question how neutral are you. So cover the full topic. Don't leave anything out. Using complete arguments just means don't have fallacies. Don't use superficial appeals. Like when you're being informative and you're being objective and you're trying to get people to trust you because you're really truly describing the situation, be honest. And being honest is telling the truth and using complete real arguments, right? So use complete Tolman arguments. Have a conclusion, support it with something, and make sure that warrant is sound. Now, this last one is actually a really important thing to remember, even if you don't give speeches, but just if you have to persuade people, whether it's with clients, with customers, with getting investors, I don't know, you're running a YouTube channel and you're trying to get, not YouTube, but I don't know, you're an entrepreneur, you're trying to get people to buy into your product or service, whatever it may be, is you actually always want to start out being informative before you're persuasive. So you don't want to start out being super persuasive first with the hard sell, because that usually turns people off. You've probably seen this. Have you ever seen a lot of people now, I realize you're not exposed to ads as much as maybe 15, 20 years ago, thanks to cord cutting and all that sort of stuff. But it's sort of like, let's say you're on YouTube and you still are, you're getting ads. The ads come on and the person's right away, they're like, the number one way to make money in the new economy, right? And this guy's like 20 and he's on his own private island with his girl there. And he's sitting behind a Lamborghini that's just somehow on this beach. I don't know how it got there, but it's just in the middle of the beach. And he goes, it's not by selling physical products on Amazon. And he burns a package, right? He goes, no, it's through Amazon's other company, Audible. And then you quickly hit skip, right? As soon as you can. You don't want to listen to this. Or the guy comes on and he's yelling at you and he goes, why are you not making money right now investing in real estate with other people's money? Right? There's the guy on the treadmill and he's super fit. He's just running and he's eating a donut. And he goes, this does not make you fat. Right? Then they show him doing curls, eating pizza. And he goes, this does not make you fat. Want to learn the real secrets? My 21-day detox below. Click below, right? Now you skip away from this stuff, right? This is like old infomercials that used to talk about how you could get rich quick. And people would just they would come on the middle of the night, by the way. Little fun fact for you, old vintage TV watchers. And you would turn the channel as fast as you could unless you just lost the remote or were too lazy to get up and get it. And just like you skip away from these YouTube apps. So why do these ads bother you? Why are they irritating? Why did you not watch the whole 3-minute video and then buy this guy's mastermind to learn how to make money in the new economy? Well, it's probably because a part of you thought this is too good to be true, right? It's bullshit. You're talking about how easy it is for me to make money to be some millionaire. And by the way, you should be thinking that, right? Like a couple of red flags should be going off. First of all, if it was so easy, why are you telling me the secrets? Because if everybody knows the secret, it ain't going to be as easy anymore. So why are you giving it away? Right? You got that one. That should, right, be the red flag. But anyway, this usually turns people off. They don't want to hear it, right? Now, what are they doing? Why does this irritate you? Because remember, I said like your initial thought is probably you turn it because it's too good to be true. Well, the reason you think it's too good to be true is because they're being persuasive before they're being informed, right? They're coming right away with you're going to make money, 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 or you name the awesome thing. Money, money, money with little work, right? Or become the fitness model in 21 days, right? It's too good to be true. And you feel that way because they're persuasive first. That just turns people away. And because if you think about it, they've given you no informative to feel like this is logical or rational, right? For this to be real. And that's why you want to be informative first, because you want to set a foundation so people feel like, okay, um, I can see how this is real. Because if you think about it, at the end of the day, all of the things they're talking about can be done. Like you can make a lot of money. You can be financially independent. You can be financially independent and young and be on that island. You can be financially independent and get a Lamborghini. You can become a fitness model. All of these things are, and eat a donut now and then. Like these things are real. Now, you probably can't do it in 21 days, and it's probably not going to be through this guy's course about Audible, but they can be done, right? So it's possible. But when they come on like that and are just persuasive right away, like look at all the awesome things you're going to get, you are likely to just think, man, this is way too. It's a scam. It's a pie in the sky because they weren't informed at first and didn't lay a foundation. So there's a phrase in persuasion, and it's this: people love to buy, they hate to be sold. And what that means is you are willing to be persuaded. You know, when you go into Best Buy, they're not a nonprofit. They're there to sell you something and make money. You're okay with that. As long as you feel like whatever you bought in Best Buy was, I don't know, actually worth buying. Like if you bought a PlayStation, you got your entertainment value out of it. You just don't want to feel like you were being taken advantage of. You want to feel like it was a logical, rational decision. That's like people love to buy, they hate to be sold. That's what that's coming down to. We want to feel like the decisions we make are logical and rational. And the bottom line is, if you're persuasive first, people don't feel like the decisions are being made that way. And they don't like it. It makes them uncomfortable. And they click skip, right? So always be informed before you're persuasive. Going back to the example I used in the beginning of this video, when that client comes in, I don't start out by saying I need $5,000, right? I lead with information they maybe haven't thought of that's new, a different context. I then explain all of their options to them, all the different price points, including ways to go that are cheaper than hiring me, right? And ways that are more expensive than me, like lawyers they could hire that are more expensive. And then at the end, after I've been informative and I've laid this foundation, then, right, then I tell them it's, hey, if you hire me, it's $5,000. Because now, even though I got to the same endpoint, this is the amount of money I need for you to hire me, and I hope you hire me. You are more likely to trust me because I was informed at first, and you feel like you're not being sold the snake oil. You're willing to buy now, right? And so be informed at first so people feel like the decision they're making, if they do decide to do what you want or agree with you, or if you're being persuasive at the end, they feel like it's a logical or rational decision. So always be informed before you're persuasive. Now, obviously, if you're giving a straight informative presentation, then you're going to be informative the whole way through. So I hope you found this video useful, and I will see you guys in the next one.